introducing the first speaker this afternoon, Gary Dickersman. Tell me if I pronounce it correctly. I come from Italy, so I'm trying, of course, to have a good pronunciation of your names, but maybe I can miss something. So we are going to have a talk by Gary on learning and performance analytics for the digital transformation of the knowledge ecosystem. And actually, he will talk about how organizations support employee and customer learning and performance with different kind of systems, and the presentation frames a knowledge ecosystem model that normalizes the repositories, the research mechanisms, and the associated measures of performance. So metrics and analytics around key performance indicators are presented as enablers of cost efficiency and sustainable digital transformation. Very interesting topic that is really transversal. So I think I'm going to give the floor to Gary. His talk will last about 1 hour, and then we have Gila Kurtz from the Holland Institute of Technology. We are all looking forward to her talk too. Thank you. So the floor is yours.
Very well. Yes, please. Yeah, and I appreciate the Italian accent. I grew up in a large Italian family. In fact, I thought my name was Mangia until I was 5. If you don't know, it means eat. And every room I walked into, a relative said Mangia. So anyway, so some of the slides, the text is a little small. It's not intended for you to read it. It's just some things that were pulled off of the program. And the other thing I want to say is that all I really wanted to do for slides on this was 4 graphics and talk. And I practiced it quite a bit with a number of colleagues, my wife who's in early childhood education and so forth. And by using just those 4 slides, the shortest I could make the talk was about 2.5 hours. So I decided I would take the non-linear sequential and make it linear sequential and do slides. I really don't mean them so much just to sequence my stuff, but it's a matter of time management. So I apologize if I have some bulleted items and text and stuff like that, but there's enough graphics, I think, that we'll be happy with that. Okay, that's not working. I don't know if this thing is on. Okay, so this is the abstract of the paper that I wrote for this, and what I'm doing is delivering the paper. So let me summarize it. As a result of the pandemic, organizations shifted from e-learning, from regular learning to e-learning and hybrid, and accomplished a lot of mixed success, and I'm sure all you would agree with that. For businesses to survive, the focus shifted to business data, because no matter what was going on and how the shift in learning and performance occurred, businesses had trouble staying in business. I came from the travel industry, so you can imagine what happened there. It barely survived. I mean, some of the support for travel and the travel agencies themselves, and the case study that I'm going to talk about has a lot to do with that industry. So what I started to see is the learning and performance budgets start to shrink. And all of the emphasis was on data science, data analytics, and so forth. And I'll explain what that means. But in looking at that, and also being engaged as a consultant in writing blogs for startup companies and so forth that were in that data science space, that I scratched my head, because since about, well, my friend Hal is here in the audience, and we've been together doing this stuff since 1824. As a matter of fact, let me ask a question. How many of you remember Plato, the Plato system, not Plato the philosopher? There's one. That was the first computer-based training system by Control Data. And then after that, when the PC came out in 1980, 81, there was the McGraw-Hill Interactive Authoring System, was the first example of what we'll call democratization of technology. In other words, an authoring program rather than a programming language, right? It was a way to get people like you and me to be able to develop instruction in a responsible way, more or less, and to not have to be experts in whatever was the popular language, C++, Fortran, whatever what was around at the time. All right, so there are a lot of terms that are being thrown around now, and you probably have heard the term digital transformation. How many of you heard that? Have heard that? How many of you experienced digital transformation? And how many of you really don't know what it means? It's probably a lot of hands go up, right? Okay, so it's a process of extracting wisdom, which means sound operating principles for continuous improvement from data as it moves through a pipeline and ultimately through an intelligent data pipeline, right? And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. And here are some of the terms. I'm Mac literate, and I'm trying to scroll here because it's not scrolling.
So do you actually accidentally stop the screen sharing? So would you mind
Go ahead, you fix.
Yeah, sorry.
I will continue talking while he's fixing that, but I'm going to go through a case study from the travel industry. Okay, and grounding this, it's not just travel agents and travel agencies and airlines and so forth, but there are essentially 3 companies in the world that develop what were traditionally called global distribution systems. What's a global distribution system? It's where the airlines, the car companies, the hospitality, hotel companies, rail, all modes of travel, right? Whether it's leisure, business, whatever. Those companies take their wares, their offerings, their flight segments, their hotel availability, all of that stuff, and they put it into one system. The global distribution companies contract with suppliers, airline, cars, etc., for them to put the content into the system so that travel agencies will book their wares, right? You probably all know, if you book travel, you can go to, Southwest Airlines or whatever your airline is, go directly to their site and book travel. But you probably use something like Expedia or whatever, or you call a travel agency, or you have a corporate travel agency. And what they do is they use a system that brings together all of these things, right? All of these things into one place, and they can book, multiple segments with, leisure, golfing, and whatever that happens in between their business and all that. Very complex systems. And let me just say one thing before I move on with this on the issue of analytics and so forth. Okay, a little bit of my background. I'm a mathematician. I have the equivalent of a degree in nuclear engineering, cognitive science, and so forth. In the nuclear engineering, I trained sailors in the Navy to operate nuclear power plants, nuclear propulsion, not weapons. So I know that field really well. Exchanging tickets through a travel agency or whatever, and getting it right, getting the fares right and all that, is infinitely more complex than nuclear engineering, okay? just so you know that. And so what I was faced with in that industry was several things when I came in to consult on looking at their infrastructure. One was they had a help desk, right? They put out about 200 different products. A lot of them are interface products. Some of them are just back-end products, all of that sort of thing. So, I mean, how many of you are involved with training at any degree that has to do with, you know, how does somebody use a piece of technology? Some of you do, right? Okay, so that's kind of the context. That's sort of what I've been doing for years, and trying to balance between the interface and the development of the system and the simplicity of the system versus what you have to train on. And everybody knows the old story. The systems were crummy. They would throw that over the wall and say it was a training problem or whatever. And we had to try to fix that. So it got into a lot of human factors engineering, interface design, all of that sort of thing. So what I was faced with was a knowledge base and a help desk that had to do with supporting customers who have a customer on the phone who has 17 segments of travel that they're booking, and one of them has to be changed, right? And it's not working. They're not getting the fare returned or something like that. So they call the help desk or they look at the knowledge base. The knowledge base had not been tuned. In other words, search meant absolutely nothing. And if I've got a customer on the phone and I need an answer, I want to talk to a human being. And the human beings were relatively incompetent. It takes you 10 years to learn the basics of how exchanges work and all of that sort of thing. And they have people on the help desk that are 3 months old. I mean, have 3 months of training, right? And they're trying to answer questions to people who know more about the industry and all of the subtleties than the person they're asking questions to. That's number one. Number two, they had a learning management system with some e-learning and a lot of instructor-led training. And then also a latecomer to this organization was the online help systems associated with those 200 applications, all right? So think about this as knowledge domains, right? And that's where we're going to get to with knowledge ecosystem. You've got a knowledge base, knowledge management, right? And help desk. You've got an LMS and you've got e-learning and instructor-led training, and you've got help systems. Stovepiped organizations, not talking to one another, you know, responsible for their own domain and so forth. And the information they're getting to make a change, develop a course or whatever is coming from product, right? Product development, product managers, and all of that sort of thing. So ask yourself a question. How does the communication take place in that context? Okay, let me hide that. So I know those are a little small. Those are the repositories that I was just talking about, right? Those 4 repositories. And those red lines just represent sort of ad hoc communication. Oh, we're making a change. Something happened at the help desk. This doesn't work. Fix that, right? So an email goes out or something gets put on a file system or on SharePoint or something like that. And that's supposed to be the new nugget of information that everybody uses, okay? And to make matters worse, you've got all of these places where they put those. SharePoint, Teams, Google Docs, iCloud, Dropbox. They're all over the place, and file systems. And if they do have a SharePoint system, what actually is SharePoint or Teams? That is a content management system. And there are protocols on how you manage content. Does anybody actually develop SharePoint systems that actually do content management, or are they just file systems, right? They're file systems, right? Nobody looks at the life cycle. Nobody looks at the life cycle of this is new, this is business as usual now, this is no longer relevant, it's obsolete now, and we phase it out. I mean, any financial system never throws away transactions, because even if you're canceling an account or something like that, you need to be able to review it, right? Well, what about content for learning, right? What about that? So, and the other thing is search mechanisms. How many times have you tried to search for something online, right? Try to search for something online, and all it's doing is keywords. So you get nonsense. Everybody remember Microsoft Word years ago? The paperclip? You'd write the word dear and it would pop up and say, oh, looks like you're writing a letter. You want some help? Ridiculous. Not case-based reasoning or artificial intelligence or anything like that, right? It's just, let me move on from that. Oracle Knowledge Management has great search capabilities because it's semantic. It understands parts of speech if you tune it correctly, right? This all has to do with ontology and semantic web and all of that sort of thing. And there's great things you can do so that when people put in a question that they're looking for an answer for, they get the answer, right? So the question is, okay, you can have that, but what about if you're looking for the same thing in your learning management system that doesn't have the same search engine? Or what if you're looking for the source material that comes from the product manager usually as an email or on their file system and so forth? Do you have any means to search that? If you use the same search terms across these 4 different repositories, you're never going to get the same thing if there are 4 different organizations managing that, right? So a lot of the knowledge management systems these days, or if you look at Google search and that sort of thing, they create a framework for search so that you can search multiple repositories. And look, what we're talking about here is self-service in most cases, particularly through the pandemic, because how are people learning, right? And it's not just, it's learning and performance, right? Learning and performance. So I may be just learning this for the first time. I may be reviewing this and learning, or I may be just going to the help desk because something appears to be broken, or there's something that I can't do. All right, so you got all this weird communication, bad searching, and the different repositories are all out of sync. I may learn something in my e-learning, but if I go to the knowledge base and read an article, they're not consistent, right? Why? Well, because you can't trace the content back to the source that the product manager said is pertinent, right? And they may have only communicated it to the e-learning organization and never communicated it in a timely manner to the application help or to the knowledge system. Okay, so we had all of that. So how are we going to fix that, right? There are, and I went through a lot of those questions, but let me be a little bit more systematic about it here. The questions really are, can you trace the learning and performance solution components? Once you develop an e-learning piece or an instructor-led training piece, can you look at the components that the product manager directed you to include that was important to learning the new thing? Can you trace that back to the product group? Back and forth, right? There's a life cycle. They communicate it, you massage that, you put it into your analysis, design, development, implementation, evaluation, whatever your methods are, agile, who cares? But the fact is you put it in there and it becomes a component of the learning, right? But can you trace it back and forth? And what about things like if that communication changes or that thing changes, does the e-learning or whatever, does that change automatically? Or do you have to hammer and chisel a new e-learning piece to cover this change that occurred? I'm gonna take my jacket off, it's hot. Okay, so those are pretty standard things that we're talking about, but they're perpetuated by the fact that these separate organizations are not talking to one another, that apparently the protocols that they use to develop the knowledge article versus developing the e-learning and so forth are all different. And they're different people, and they're only casually talking to one another. So how you connect all of that stuff is, and the most important thing to me is, if you're doing learning, there is a taxonomy to the domain, right? Taxonomy, Bloom's taxonomy, right? How many of you know Bloom's taxonomy? Okay, so you're looking at the least complex elements of what somebody needs to do or learn to the most complex. So recognize, recall is pretty simple. Compare and contrast to make a decision, that's more complex. Create something from scratch is much, much more. All right. So what you do is you create a list of objectives that line up with that taxonomy's progression. And then what we did there is we created use cases that address them from the simplest one. What's the simplest thing in travel that a travel agent has to do? I'm going from point A to point B and coming back. That's it. All right. That's a simple one segment or two segment, one there, one back booking. And it's very simple. And if the customer has to change that, it's not all that complex. But the things behind that is the fares, they absolutely need to be registered because it's a regulated industry, right? And there are different organizations that manage that all around the world. So it just gets really, really complex if you have multiple segments and then you have a hotel and a car and something. And imagine one part of it changes. All of you must have experienced this at one time in your life. One thing has to change. You go to the travel agent, they come back and say, oh, you're going to get a refund of this and go on this airline or whatever. But what happens behind the scenes is the stuff that's more complex than the nuclear engineering. And I mean that because one of the biggest problems for this industry is trying to automate that process so that people don't have to call airlines and verify and do all of this stuff by hand. The problem is that the utilities that do that only work about 25% of the time. Yet these companies are putting out products that say we automate this. And in fact, what some of the product managers were saying, in spite of all the training we were giving them and so forth, they would say to the customer, okay, use this piece of software that will do the exchange for you automatically, but calculate it by hand too and do all of that just to be sure it's right. Like, well, what's the point, right? So all of that was just really complex. And what the answer to this was, in part, was to combine those domains into one single organization called the knowledge ecosystem. So, and that became me at one point. I was responsible for knowledge management, help desk, e-learning, instructor-led learning, and also the application help files, right? So knowledge, all of that stuff. And if you ask yourself this question, if there's a piece of content in there, like, how do you do an exchange in this particular case, right? How do I do an exchange in this particular case? That piece of knowledge is framed in the application, certainly, as part of the instruction, and it will show you some screenshots or things like that. But the help desk article describes it in a slightly different way, but it's still the same content. So what we discovered is, from a business perspective, we have these 4 different organizations spending a boatload of money replicating the activity, replicating the content development, the product development, all that. And that's a very important thing that to come into this realization. And that is that there's a difference between content management and knowledge management. Significant difference. And I'll define that and explain it later and get into the analytics as the talk says. This diagram up here, it's kind of hard to see what's there because I redacted it. It's because there is proprietary information from one client that I can't expose. But what I would like you to see from that is that, first of all, there's a process here where content moves from product and so forth. It goes through a vetting process into a content management system and then into knowledge management. And it isn't until near the end of the process over here that we actually employ the learning solution, the knowledge article, and the help for the application. And the same group of people are doing all of that. And what they're saying is, I get this piece of information. I need to catalog it. I need to map it to the taxonomy, right? And I need to be able to maintain an intelligent pipeline from there into the knowledge articles, the e-learning, and all of that. So you get consistency. And if you recognize the type of diagram this is, it's cross-functional, right? So on the left-hand side, all of the stakeholders are involved in the vetting. And that might sound pretty arduous and so forth. But if you ground all this in the taxonomy, then everybody's singing off the same song sheet, okay? So here is what we did is we implemented process engineering in the organization, this new organization called the Knowledge Ecosystem, all right? And we put some other processes in place as well. What you see here is on the left-hand side is the learning and knowledge, and on the right-hand side is case management. Because think about this for a moment. If a customer calls and says they have a problem, right? And you're going to give them a solution, or it's going to sit there and wait for a solution and be an unresolved case or whatever, that might have been addressed much earlier in the knowledge management system via self-service or in the training or in a simple online help thing. I mean, something as simple as error messages as an application and knowing what they mean. How many of you have ever been in an application and you experienced, you'd make a mistake and something pops up and says, error 956232, call somebody, right? And it doesn't give you any more information than that. Well, that's pretty stupid when you can simply say what the problem is, right? So if you look at all of these attributes or metrics that the organizations use to improve business, it's customer satisfaction, which you can measure. There are key performance indicators, net promoter score. How many of your organizations use NPS, Net Promoter Score? Right. If you don't know what that is, Net Promoter Score is very simple. Net Promoter Score means that you have people, customers, whatever, who would recommend your business to somebody else, right? And then you have those who say, don't do business with them. Detractors, promoters, and then everybody in between. And there's a way to analytically get a score on that and sees where you sit with your competitors. Well, in this whole area, we were running negative. Okay, so we had to increase that. So the knowledge ecosystem, number one, and number two, this evaluation and improvement that involved product, help desk, the learning stuff, and case management, and all of that had to come into play. And this is another part of it here. You see up on the upper left there, you have the help desk. And then down here, you have the commercial and product teams. Over on the right is the learning management and so forth. And the diagram just shows collaboration. It shows collaboration, real-time communication about the problems that are occurring, the performance problems, because everybody knows, I mean, and the keynote speaker said this before, there are There's training. Was it the keynote speaker or was it our conversation? I don't remember before, but learning versus performance. And this has been, I mean, my company, I called it EPSS years ago, Electronic Performance Support System, performance support, right? Which is, there's a lot of definitions of it, but it was primarily give people what they need with learning as a secondary consequence, right? I can do a lot of things and learn. Hal probably remembers my old example of my two young sons who are now in their 40s. But when the younger boy was trying to learn how to ride a bicycle, he kept falling. I'm a mathematician and the physicist and all of that sort of stuff. So I said, look, Ryan, it's really simple. The momentum vector goes this way and the force vector goes this way and blah, blah, blah about balance and all of that. And the poor kid is rolling his eyes back. His brother comes over and says, stick your foot out and you won't fall. That's the day he learned to ride the bike. All that information I gave him, the affect around that information he gained through the simple note card that came from his big brother is stick your foot out. And that's what that's what performance support is all about. So we wanted to, in this knowledge ecosystem, what we wanted to do is incorporate that mentality into the solutions. So what did we really focus on here, right? The KPI and analytics that we were looking at were training cost versus resources and salary versus what we're actually seeing in the learning management system. What's the difference between business as usual and new business development? Look, what you're going to see here, notice all the business orientation of KPIs that have to do with knowledge, the knowledge ecosystem. Comparisons of learning modes by global region. Who is using e-learning and who will not? If we look, we were global. We're in 170 countries, 13 to 35 languages and so forth. We had an army of instructors, instructor-led training in Eastern Europe, but almost none in the United States. Why? Because the US had transitioned to e-learning long ago, and although it was a painful transition, they did well with it. But in other parts of the world, it's all about the affect, it's all about the social aspects, just what people are used to, what they want, and so forth. But what we didn't want to do is simply acquiesce to customers who said, I just need training, when in many cases they absolutely didn't even need any, right? So what we wanted to do is measure that stuff. So some of the other things were, you know, the cost of using organizational classrooms and as opposed to online instruction, self-service versus instructor-led learning, and we sliced all, diced all this stuff by region and all that. But really, the analytics that I'm talking about, that I'm getting to in the punchline for the talk, is not necessarily that stuff. That was important, and that got us pretty far. But what needed to change was, and you've probably all experienced it. How many of you experienced cuts in the training budget? Yeah. When the business starts to shrink or whatever, what's the first thing to go? Sometimes, but most of the time over the years, it's that. So you want to tip this thing so that your revenue and your business success goes up. But on the left-hand side, you have all those things. And the idea with the knowledge ecosystem is not to short shrift any of those things. It's just to get some efficiency. And like I said before, you had 4 organizations developing essentially the same stuff from the same content with an army of people that you could do it. I don't want to just say you can do it with less people, but you could streamline the process. The goal in this was never to just cut people. That's not the point, but it's to make that knowledge ecosystem really sing. And it's pertinent to business development, right? The other thing is recognition of there's a lot of different models around this. How many are familiar with this OSF model? OSF model is 70% of what people actually learn to perform is on the job, 20% is social and informal, and 10% is formal classroom. And how many organizations are focusing primarily on that 10%? And if that's the case, you're pissing away 90% of your opportunity there, right? So the knowledge ecosystem, the question I was always asked in this was, well, wait a minute, you're doing all this, that's not the same as training, right? The training is really important. The customers are asking for training. You got to do the training. No, I don't want to do any training. I don't. I want people to be able to perform. And I want to give them the things they need. I want to tell them to stick your foot out and you won't fall. And it doesn't mean they're not going to learn about balance or whatever. They're going to get that intuitively. And then they make, as a secondary consequence, they make it curious and so forth. It's a lot about what the keynote speaker was saying a few minutes ago. So our focus areas were business underperformance by region, help desk stress by categories. There's something called a name record in personal name record is an industry standard for booking travel, right? And screwing up a PNR, personal name record, is a big deal, right? So most of the knowledge articles, training, and all of that had to do with managing PNRs. Because if you can't give the customer the PNR, you've all booked travel and you get this thing that still looks like it comes from a line printer and it has all this thing about segments and stuff like that. That's the industry standard. That's what all of the software has to do. And if you can't get there, you've got a big problem, right? Adoption. Here's a big issue that we found. We were putting out new software. We were telling our customers, and that's ambiguous. We're telling the travel agencies that use the software that this is better. You're going to be able to book travel faster. You're going to be able to do all sorts of things better with this application. And you know what? We're going to give it to you. We're going to pay you to use it, right? Because where do we get our money? We get our money from the suppliers to put their wares into the system. And the size of the contracts associated with the suppliers is based on our projection of how many segments or tickets or whatever are issued by the travel agencies. So if you can't do that kind of predictive analytics correctly, when the contract comes up for renewal, they're either going to cancel and go with a competitor, or they're going to pay you less, right? The customers who we gave the software to, when I came aboard this one company, they said 70% of their customers was using the new system. 70% of the customers installed the system. They weren't using it. They still were doing it the old way. They were just trying to, placate the managers and stuff. The first thing that I did when I went to the company, I said, I have to go out to the customer sites and observe. Oh, no, you can't do that. How am I going to manage a knowledge ecosystem if I can't see what the hell is going on in the critical place where people are booking the travel, right? So I went there and I watched. And the first thing I saw was the manager had the system that we gave them, paid them to use, on their desk, version 10. I looked out on the floor, only 2 people were using the application. They were using version 3. Why are you using version 10? Why? Oh, I'm not going to let my people use that. It's full of bugs. And it turned out it wasn't full of bugs. The problem was that their system, their IT system didn't have the resources to run the program properly. So there was all of that sort of stuff going on. So there's a difference between adoption versus installation, right? So we had to get past that, and that requires that the entire knowledge ecosystem works for them, right? That they start seeing that they can do better with this software than their old methods. And so we looked also at the ratio of self-service activities versus submitted cases, right? You may say, what does that have to do with training? It has everything to do with training. If somebody's calling constantly to get the answer to something, and it's in the knowledge management system, and they're not looking for it because they have no confidence that the search mechanism works, but they could have got it from training and all that, and that's why all of this has to be normalized. So revenue per case is another thing. You know, you may be getting a lot of segments, but if there's a lot of problems, you're paying for your help desk, and there goes your margins, right? And we wanted to look at where were the motivations for self-service? Where were the motivations for people to switch from calling somebody on the phone, which is expensive, or taking an e-learning course or whatever and doing the self-service stuff, right? So in the slides and in the paper, there are a bunch of these goals that we had. And what you see here is which goals were achieved, which ones made significant progress, and which ones were planned and recognized. But there were still a lot of gaps remaining. And what those gaps were things like improve the learning and performance content and knowledge to foster greater business success, right? That's a high level. But after that, it's connect the dots between disparate content sources to uncover stories that provide immediate, clear business insight. What does data science do in digital transformation? It extracts wisdom from data by moving it from data, information, which is data in context, knowledge, which is information in action, meaning it solves a real problem. It's just not a bunch of stuff. And then insight, where you look at these knowledge solutions and you say, oh, I aggregate that. And it gives me some insight. And then wisdom is operating principles for continuous improvement of your business. So from data here to there is where you improve your business. That's where you get your wisdom from. That's where you get your and what we want to do here is start with content. Content that starts at the product manager, development, and so forth, and create an intelligent pipeline like the data pipeline, only starting with content and moving that to information, knowledge, insight, and wisdom, right? And that requires a lot of thinking about what's going on. There are 10 things that I list in the paper, and for the remainder of my discussion here, I got what, 9 more minutes before it's you have 9 more minutes. Okay. And I have 10 things, so I'll do each one in less than a minute. One is codifying content and knowledge. And if I'm going to spend any time, there's 2 of these slides I really have to spend some time on. This one, well, I described this before. If you get the slides, you can see how this works. This is, I know, it's tiny, it's all of that. This is just an embedded spreadsheet. And if I were to click on it, it opened. But just simply, this is the Bloom's taxonomy here. This is the levels of complexity. These are the objectives associated with each level of complexity. And these are use cases. So we say, all right, I'm not just saying the objective is for you to be able to properly book travel and then be able to do an exchange and blah, blah, blah. No. First, what I want to do is get you from point A to point B. Get this butt in this seat, get to this city and back, right? And that's the early part of it. I described it before. You can see the details when you look at the slides in detail, right? And what that does is looks at the pipeline. It creates an intelligent pipeline. It grounds everything. You need to ground things in the technology. We've said for years that we need objectives in training, and you can't just say, go learn this stuff, and without, you put objectives up front. Well, there's more than that. It's not just learning objectives, it's performance objectives, right? And what are the objectives for? They're really for performance, doing, right? And we need case studies that map those two. So if every piece of content that comes from the product development team, if every piece of content that came from them was cataloged some way, right, to be understandable by a machine, semantic encoding, ontology, all of that. If I could do that with everything that comes out and have it managed as content, then I can create that intelligent pipeline from which I extract wisdom. So that's the codifying content and knowledge. And the definitions are really simple. Content is stuff, and it's anything. And it comes from everywhere. It's in emails, it's this, that, and that. We just got to get our arms around it. How many of you know what a data warehouse is? How many of you know what a data lake is? One guy here, because you're a computer science guy, right? All right, a data warehouse is where you take data that is, and you structure it carefully, and then you put it all into a system so that the business analysts can make it rock without having to do too much to that data. A data lake is different. Structured, unstructured, doesn't matter what it is and where it comes from. It all goes into the same lake. You know, the warehouse is organized. The lake is not. You know, there's dead horses in there and seaweed and all of that stuff. And what it does is puts everything in one place. And if you're going to do analytics from there, then you do some of the data massaging and all of that. But we're going to be in a really good shape for a knowledge ecosystem if we codify that content initially according to a taxonomy. And we impose semantic encoding on it. All right, and there's different things that means. So this is just the build on that slide was going from data or content to wisdom. And the thing that grounds it is the taxonomy. And I would think at this time that almost every organization would be doing, who is involved with learning, would be documenting taxonomies and so forth. You know, it's like the keynote speaker said, what circumstances, right? What's the context for this, right? Why am I doing this? What's the travel related knowledge that's associated with it? And how does a machine understand parts of speech and all of that sort of stuff? That has to be in the learning. That has to be in the help. That has to be in the knowledge. And if you don't do that kind of codification up front, where the people are saying, I think we got to train on this, then you're not going to be able to manage that. You're not going to get wisdom from it. So you have to manage content quality, accuracy, completeness, consistency, integrity, currency, relevance, all of that. The ecology, it's very simple. We've had wildfires for years, right? Wildfires for years all over the place where, and the reason is because of poor, besides climate change, is poor management. We used to not burn out the old undergrowth, right? And then you'd wind up with more. Well, that's what happens in knowledge and content. SharePoint system, more and more stuff. When I first went to this organization, they gave me access to the knowledge base. I searched on something, which is the most contemporary system. And I got knowledge articles from, this was 2014. I got knowledge articles from 2010 and 2009 that had nothing to do with what they had today, right? The knowledge base had never been cleaned out. It had never been tuned. It had never been encoded, let alone the content that serves it, right? So knowledge ecology, and that's a big deal. Data quality management. I can give you links if you want to blogs I've written for data science companies on why you need data quality management. It's the same thing for content. Reuse and repurpose, all I'll say simply is there was an intention in 1997. Sorry, I should have left that slide up a little bit longer. There was, why isn't it going back? Okay, I'm sorry, I'm pushing the buttons for going backward and it's going forward. But anyway, just to continue on with this, The automation I mentioned before about continuous improvement when something changes from the product manager and how it manifests in the entire knowledge ecosystem. Well, that's what these processes that I showed you before, the little icons on the bottom, that's what that started to accomplish. Because then you could trace the components of the training and the knowledge back to the source. And it was semantic as well. So that was really helpful. A big problem that we have, though, is in privacy and compliance. How many of you know what GDPR is? You do. GDPR is it's privacy, right? It's why when you go to a website today and it says, we use cookies. Do you agree? Do you want us to use them? Because they use that stuff in marketing and all that, it's privacy. Well, in learning and performance and knowledge and all of that stuff, personalization is what's important, correct? Right? Learning for me. But what happens when you anonymize, and when you anonymize or anonymize, whatever the word is, it acts contrary to personalization. You're extracting things to make it look like you don't know who it does, who does it, and you have to do that for compliance. Yes, right? Yeah. 5? Okay. So I'm going to end with one thing here. There's a number of other things, but this is the most important thing here I want to show you. This is the result of all the work we did, and it's not complete. On the left-hand side here is the system. This is this is the whole knowledge ecosystem over here. It's telling you, basically, when I got to this point where I'm actually changing a seat for a customer, it identifies that and says, oh, you're changing a seat, right? And then it kind of tells me what to do next. I start moving forward and then I get stuck. I get this screen here. This is really lousy software that was developed. Like, what do I do next here? Well, it says I have to book this as an EMD. So this gets pulled directly out of the knowledge base, and I haven't left the system. I haven't left my context. And then if that's not enough, I go here, which has the same content, but it's a learning simulation where I can go to any particular step in what I'm supposed to do in the system and understand what it is. That way, when I go back to my system here, I know that what I was supposed to do is this. And then the next step was I had to pull this out here. I had to copy something, put it in here for the PNR, blah, blah, blah. I get it. And there's the result. So what it did was, in my context where I got stuck, where I needed information, it gave me everything in the knowledge base. It gave me everything in the e-learning system. It gave me all of the resources I have that are related. And the only way it can do that is if one organization manages all that stuff. All right? So the knowledge ecosystem is on the right here. And it's amazing the business performance improvement that we got out of all of that stuff. So anyway, I'll kind of end there and just say this, that 2 minutes, that the analytics that are important here are not necessarily the ones that we do today at the end of the process. It's the ones at the beginning of the process that are important. The content encoding, the semantics. You've got to get the machine to be able to communicate with the human being and understand strings and so forth the same. And a lot of this came from knowledge management and overlaying that onto learning management. So anyway, I went over a little bit there, but there's still some time for questions. Anybody have a question?
Yeah, 1 minute for the question.
Okay.
Maybe it's better to have the questions at the end. I think it's better. Otherwise,
Okay.
I don't know if there's one quick question.
One quick question. I'm sorry about that.
One quick. So one quick question. Otherwise, we can have questions in the end in order to leave everyone.
Yeah,
have
and
it done.
if you submit questions and so forth, I mean, I'll answer them in email or whatever the mechanism is here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, hope you found
Thank
it
you,
useful.
Gary. Thank you. Thank you.